All right, I am hoping that this map looks vaguely familiar since you looked at it at the very last section of the last lecture. This sets up what happens when Abraham Lincoln comes into office. Things are obviously not as simple as Abraham Lincoln gets elected, everybody leaves the Union from the South, and then off we go to war. We have to at least make an attempt to pick apart what each side brings to the table. I provide you with this excellent pie graph, which of course I did not make. It's generally assumed that the North will run away with this war because of the resources at their disposal. And so I wanted to show you why people make that argument. The South is very heavily reliant on imports. They import food, they import manufactured goods, and before they were bringing a lot of it in for the North. Obviously that will stop as soon as the war begins, so they're going to have to find new areas from which to import things. They also are going to need to rely really heavily on local support for their army, for their supplies. This will be a little different. A lot of farmers in the South had done nothing but cash crops, which would be not food, things like cotton and tobacco, things of that nature. And so now the South is going to have to ask for people to stop growing so much cotton, stop growing so much tobacco, and put in crops that will benefit the Southern cause. And they're not going to be real successful at that, which creates this sort of long-term problem that we end up with. The South does have a couple of advantages, which could also be seen as disadvantages, like the fact that they're going to do most of their fighting on their own turf. The North will have to be aggressive. It's one of the biggest problems facing President Lincoln's army, is that they're going to need to go in and defeat the South. So the South has the advantage of fighting for home turf, but that will also become a disadvantage as so much of the South gets destroyed. They will not permit their slaves to fight. That would have balanced out, let's look at this population pie, it would have given the South at least better than 29% if they had included slaves into their fighting people count. One of the things they will do is use slaves to do war-related work. Obviously, slaves growing crops will help, but slaves digging barricades, and slaves bringing water, and slaves doing various things in factories during the war will help. The South has a very clear goal. Their goal is to become an autonomous, independent country so that they can keep slaves. The North's goal is a little bit more fuzzy. They want to preserve the Union, but what exactly does that even mean? Do you want to preserve a Union when almost half of it doesn't want to be there anymore? That's an intellectual goal. It's not a physical, tangible goal. And that's going to be one of the problems that the North has to overcome. The South goes into this war, South Carolina especially, feeling like England will help them. France will help them. Those two countries rely on Southern cotton to keep their industries moving. So the South thinks there's no way in the world that England and France will shut down their factories in order to help the North and to not provide assistance to the South. The problem with that is that that assumption about England and France helping the South is how they establish their war plan. They make an assumption about the position of England and France, and they start planning as if that assumption is fact. And when push comes to shove, neither England nor France will provide a lot of assistance to the South. Part of that has to do with the fact that the English in particular dislike slavery a lot. They have abolished it in all of their colonies, and Queen Victoria, who will be the monarch in England during this time, finds slavery to be very distasteful. So the English people and the English leadership don't feel comfortable about buying cotton from slaves already, but they really feel uncomfortable about helping to fight a war that will ensure that slaves remain enslaved possibly forever. So they are not going to provide the kind of assistance that the South was expecting. The North obviously looks good on the pie chart. We got lots of railroad mileage, lots of industrial workers to crank out all of the things that you need. You can see that the manufacturing, the North possesses 86% of all of the manufacturing in the United States. They have 3 times as many people. These things will be important, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee a win. And that's kind of what the South is counting on. The South knows this. This isn't a secret. But they expect that because they'll be fighting on home territory, all they have to do to win this thing is survive. It's kind of like the American Revolution in a sense. If the South can remain intact, then they have proven that they are in fact kind of a legitimate country. The North is going to have to prevent that from happening. That's a much more difficult goal, actually. So despite the fact that all of these resources seem to swing in the North's favor, things are not necessarily going to shape up that way to start with. The first shots of the Civil War officially are fired in the spring of 1861 at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter sits in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And you know this from the first half of this course, that South Carolina is a problem child. It was the state that tried to nullify a tariff during the Jackson presidency. Even during the colonial period, South Carolina put their interests in front of the interests of the nation as a whole. And here during the Civil War, they're going to lead the charge. South Carolina has 3 times as many slaves as they have white people. They have a very vested interest in seeing slavery survive forever. Their entire agricultural and economic system is dependent on slavery. They will fire the first shots because they are confident of a victory. Secession is not necessarily something that is spelled out very clearly. There is nothing in the Constitution about leaving. It's not in there. There's no escape route. So they're going to kind of make up their own here. Lincoln believes, and this is something he believes profoundly, kind of in his core, that secession is illegal. That there is a reason that there is no allowance for it in the Constitution. There's no way out of the Union. If you're in, you're in. As of 1787, when you apply for statehood, after that, you are locked in forever. For the life of this country, you are stuck. And Southerners, most of them who support secessionism, don't believe that at all. So we have a misunderstanding, or I guess a better word is a disagreement about whether or not this is even possible. The issue with Fort Sumter is fairly simple. We've got Union troops or federal troops who are in Fort Sumter who are responsible for Charleston Harbor. They only have so many supplies, and when they start to run low, they ask for reinforcements, new supplies to be brought down from the north. The Southerners in South Carolina in particular have said, look, if you resupply that fort, we're going to start blowing stuff up. Lincoln makes a decision. He needs to at least try to resupply this fort, so he sends supplies, the Southerners fire on it, and that's kind of how we get to the first points of the Civil War. But it's important to know that there is war happening before Fort Sumter. There's just not necessarily a ton of fighting. Lincoln mobilizes for war right after he is inaugurated in the spring of 1861. The South, the states that have already seceded, they are already accepting enlistments into their military before this ever happens. There is a general perception that war is inevitable. It just is a matter of where is it going to start and when. And so this is our where and when. But in the South, they are putting together military units. They are signing up generals and officers. They are seizing federal depositories. So they seize Harper's Ferry, which is an arsenal. They seize banking systems that have federal gold in them. So they are seizing U.S. property, and they're going to convert that into Confederate property. So they are acting aggressively way before the first shots are actually fired here. When southern states secede, their representatives in Washington, D.C. leave. So there will be no more Congress people from the South after 1861. We got a couple holdouts, but they're kind of powerless. While all of those people are gone, the North takes advantage of their absence. There have been a lot of things on the table that Southern congressmen wouldn't allow to get done because they didn't like them, because they objected based on Southern interests. So, the North will now be responsible for the entire federal government for the next 4 years. So they jump into action. And a lot of this has nothing to do with war and everything to do with things that were good for the North that the South wouldn't allow them to have. So one of them is the Morrill Land Grant Act. You may have never heard of this before, but the Morrill Land Grant Act sets up a system so that states can receive money. Actually, they receive land that they can sell for money in order to build state universities that will support agriculture and engineering. So, Texas A&M, Ohio State, my alma mater, which is Purdue. These are all land grant institutions. Every state in the country today supports a land grant institution. The South didn't like to spend money on public schools, which is why they wouldn't allow federal money, or federal land in this case, to be used to support public schools. Congress will also pass the Homestead Act while the South is gone. The Homestead Act divides up remaining U.S. territory into small family farms and gives those small family farms away almost for free. Those are not slave farms. Those are small family farms that you work with your family. You can see why the South objected to the Homestead Act. They also admit Kansas as a state while the South is gone. They make plans to move the transcontinental rail line through the North and not the South. They construct a new national banking structure, which will start to print money that's referred to as the greenback. It is a printed dollar, which of course is what we use today, but the first greenbacks are printed during the Civil War as a way to try to curb inflation, which tends to happen during times of war like this, but also pass a small income tax. The greenback, it's not gold or silver, it's just paper. So the worth of that dollar fluctuated a little bit during the Civil War, but it's not too bad. And it gives the federal government a way to pay people and pay for things in money that isn't gold or silver. They're going to spend a lot of gold and silver on the military, so they need to have a way to sort of create currency without actually having to use gold and silver for any of it. And so that's how the greenback comes in handy. To prepare the North for war, we need to drum up support. And you might be surprised, we talked a little bit about how there isn't necessarily a clear-cut purpose here like there is in the South, but lots of people do enlist for the Northern Army because they feel like maybe slavery is bad, or they feel like the South has gone too far, or the South is a bully. A lot of people had neutral feelings about slavery, but really thought that the South was totally out of line here and that they needed to be put in their place. A total of 2 million people end up serving in the Union Army over the course of the war. If you volunteered, you signed up for 3 years and you were paid a bounty. You can see on this poster, this is a real poster from the Civil War for riflemen or sharpshooters. Their bounty is $22, and at the end of the war they'll be paid $100 in addition to their regular monthly pay. For some people this was a lot of money, but the problem is to get your $100 bonus, you actually have to survive until your term of service is up. Lincoln is going to fight and lead the entire Civil War without actually declaring a war. When you read what he wrote about it, he refers to it regularly as a domestic insurrection. He argues that you can't have a war if the people you are fighting have left illegally. He just is sort of saying, well, they're not a real country, so this is just a domestic problem. These are just states run amok and we have to fix it. So this isn't a war. This is us fixing this insurrection. We are putting down an insurrection inside our own country. Lincoln doesn't necessarily get universal support. Obviously, he wasn't elected by kind of massive, overwhelming numbers. But he even has people who are left in the North who disagree with him fighting the South to keep them in the Union. Those people get the nickname Copperhead. Lincoln has a number of these people arrested because they were constantly sort of speaking out against him and against the Union. He kind of pulls a John Adams here. This is a little bit of the Alien and Sedition Acts coming back in our purview. Lincoln understands the right... He understands the right for people to be able to speak out about the war, but he feels like the Copperheads are actually Southerners in disguise. That these people are traitors at this point, because we need to take care of this problem, and they are undermining the war effort, and so he throws them in jail. They don't get due process. He uses technically what are war powers to keep them in jail and try to silence them as much as possible. They don't get a speedy trial, especially in the border states. That's going to be kind of a key component here. He also doesn't want anybody to argue later on against the draft law that will be put in place. So those people can be put in prison. The Supreme Court does try to step in here. The Supreme Court, obviously, you remember the Dred Scott decision, there are a lot of Southern sympathizers on the court, and many of them stay on the court throughout the war. They ordered Lincoln at one point to release a prisoner because that prisoner had not been given his habeas corpus rights, or his right to a fair and speedy trial, and Lincoln refuses. So we generally see Lincoln during the Civil War as providing leadership. He's generally thought of as being one of the best one or two presidents we've ever had. But there are examples here of him really stretching the bounds of executive power so that he can manage this war effectively. The war in the North increases the importance of industries like coal and the railroad. We need more farm machinery because we've got 2 million people serving, so we need machines to pick up the slack for some of the people who will be actually doing the fighting. And the North is going to be pretty successful at that. They're going to be able to use all of that industry that already exists to try and make up for the fact that 2 million people will be not able to actually work on farms or in factories. In the South, they are going to take a page kind of out of the Articles of Confederation from before the Constitution was written. They're going to declare themselves to be a confederation of states, which means that at this point most of the power will be returned to the states. That was one of the things that they were upset about, was that the federal government was dictating various policies in regards to economics and slavery and so forth. So by returning to a loose confederation of states, their hope is that then states will be able to be kind of self-determinant. States write new constitutions in the South during the Civil War. They institute in those constitutions a system of permanent slavery. Essentially, their new constitutions say things like slavery can never be abolished. Their new capital will be Richmond, Virginia. Their new president of the Confederacy is Jefferson Davis. He was formerly a senator from Mississippi. One of the problems that the South faces immediately is money. They don't have enough. They have seized as much federal money as possible, so they've got gold and silver that they've taken from the federal government, but it's not enough. One of the ways that they generate money is to sell war bonds. People who were loyal to the Confederacy, who were enthusiastic about the Confederate cause, purchased war bonds, which are really a way to loan the government money. We do this today. You buy bonds, there's a little bit of interest tacked onto them. You can cash them in after 10 or 20 or 30 years and make a little bit of money, and you have essentially helped the federal government by loaning them some cash. The North does this too, but the South relies really heavily on things like war bonds to try and bring in revenue. They also need to borrow heavily from foreign countries, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem because they don't have their own credit. Their credit is tied to the federal government. One of the ways that you can prove that you have good credit is obviously to be good payers on your debt. This is a problem. Because this is a confederation of states, the South will have the same problem collecting taxes that the United States did during the Articles of Confederation. When you ask the states for money and you don't have a way to actually get it from them, they won't give it to you. That's the same thing that happened in the 1780s. It happens here in the South during the 1860s. Jefferson Davis asks each state to put in their share of taxes, and most of them say no. So right from the beginning, the Confederate government doesn't have a good way to get income. They will start to print their own money. You know, they're a new country, they have to have their own currency. The problem is that their stockpile of money is only $1 million. They tried an income tax. They try asking banks for money. People don't trust them enough to lend them very much money because obviously this is an unstable situation. With only $1 million as their kind of the start of their own treasury, they can't print very much money because people know that money is worthless. If you only have $1 million in the bank and you're spending it faster than you're bringing it in, every Confederate bill that you print is worth a fraction of what it should be worth. And this is an enormous problem for the Confederacy, this issue of their own currency. It's almost worthless from the beginning. People tried to use it. They ended up doing a lot of bartering and trading, or a lot of using gold and silver. And we've got examples of quite a few of them actually using federal money to do business because their money isn't worth anything. The other very surprising problem the South runs into is that because they don't have much of a federal government, you know, this idea here is that they wanted a confederation of states. So the national government that's headed by Jeff Davis, really they expect it to be small. The problem is they're in the middle of a war. How do you have a small government during a war? You can't have the states with their own everything. They can't have their own general. They can't have their own standing army. They can't do that when you're fighting an entire government that's united. What ultimately ends up happening is that the Southern national government, the Confederate government, is bigger than the federal government in the North. They build so many departments and have so many employees and so many agencies, and Jefferson Davis tries to micromanage all of these pieces that it totally fails to have any effectiveness at all. So what started out as an effort to have states be the most powerful entities in this Confederacy ends up with a huge national government, an enormously weak financial system, because the states are unwilling to participate in the way that the Confederacy needs them to. They're looking out for their own interests first, and the interests of the country second. There are political problems for both of these guys. You got Lincoln on the left, Davis on the right. Davis has, obviously, this enormous problem of how do you start a country from scratch during the middle of a war. He's got states that won't cooperate. He's got factories that don't have enough output, farms that aren't growing enough food, foreign countries who won't help him, and this huge bureaucracy that he's trying to manage. Lincoln has a different kind of problem. He has a bureaucracy that's already set up. He has money that's already established. His problem is that his cabinet dislikes him intensely. He's got a whole cabinet of guys who want to be president themselves. And so they do everything they can in roughly the first 18 months of the war or so to undermine his authority at every possible turn. So what we end up with is Lincoln understanding that they hate him and that they want him to fail, but they want the country to win. So he ends up being this kind of lone horse, this solitary figure. He makes a lot of these decisions by himself. He doesn't really involve the cabinet in a lot of decisions until much later in his presidency, well into kind of the end of his first term and the start of his second term. Foreign policy is a situation that the South has to deal with almost more than the North, because they have to start from scratch. The American minister to England is an Adams. It's Charles Francis Adams, who is the son of John Quincy Adams. I know, it's a whole family of diplomats and federal employees. Charles Francis Adams has a really important job, and most people have never even heard of this guy. But his job is to keep England out of this war. He knows, everybody knows, that English factories run on Southern cotton. So how do you get the English to stop buying cotton from the South and to not involve themselves in this civil war? Charles Francis Adams does a heck of a job here. They are threatened by northern industry in England. They see us building more factories. They see us developing more industry, and they don't want to have to compete with the United States. They also don't like our tariff system. We keep slapping tariffs on English goods, so they don't sell as much here as they feel like they should. But ultimately, what prevails is that Charles Francis Adams seems to be a very nice man, and the English like him a lot, by all accounts. And he keeps pushing the issue of slavery. He says, you are supporting an industry in the South that sells children away from mothers, that allows grown men to be whipped in front of their wives. You are supporting that every time you buy a bale of their cotton. And the English people, just average everyday English people, are so troubled by that they actually stop working when they run out of Southern cotton. Now, there's a hitch to this, though, because, see, the English, they kind of saw this coming. The 1850s were a troubled time in the United States, and that wasn't any secret to anybody who was paying attention. So, the English have stockpiled cotton. They have been overbuying for the last 3 years in order to have a stockpile in case there came a time where they couldn't get enough cotton. So they have an extra supply. They don't have to buy from the South in the same amount that they were before. And while they are using their stockpile, they cut back production a little bit. So English people actually suffer willingly as a result of our Civil War, because they say, look, we'll just stop working for a while instead of helping these people keep slaves. In the meantime, England goes to some of its other colonies to try to look for new sources of cotton, and they luck out, because you can grow cotton very successfully in Egypt and India. And Egypt and India are both English colonies during this time. So they will start a separate cotton production elsewhere to make up for the fact that they don't want to have to buy any cotton from the South. This is what totally undermined the Southern idea that they were going to be able to rely on help from England and France. Not only do England and France not offer a lot of financial support in the way of loans or supplies or weapons, they do give a little bit, but they refuse to buy a lot of Southern cotton, which cripples the Southern economy before it even gets its feet on the ground. Nobody in Europe will give the South any kind of diplomatic acknowledgement. The South does send its own ambassadors over to France and England. But when you are a new country, your ambassador has to be formally recognized. That's how you know your country is for real. Nobody will formally recognize the South, because they're not real confident the South is going to win. That is a huge obstacle for the South, because in that sense, Charles Francis Adams, he's the only voice that England is listening to. They know that the South needs their help, but he's the only recognized American ambassador in England. Women play a fairly substantial role for both sides. In the North, we have a formal system of nursing and aid provision, which is called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The Sanitary Commission holds auctions to raise money for the troops. They provide hospital and nursing care services. They will donate bandages and clothing and blankets. There is a lot of kind of homegrown effort to support the Union Army during the Civil War. Clara Barton, who is the lady on the left-hand side there, is a professional nurse. She actually trained as a war nurse in Europe during the 1840s and 50s. So she comes over here and teaches women how to be battlefield hospital nurses. She is the founder of the American Red Cross, which is kind of developed during this time period. In addition to being nurses, because both sides have female nurses, although the South, it should be said, because there's this built-in idea about the proper behavior of a Southern woman, you do not find a lot of Southern nurses, not nearly as many as you do in the North, because Southern men believed it was inappropriate for Southern women to do that kind of work. So these strict cultural mores that they have in place actually prohibit a lot of women from helping. They get a little bit better about that as they get more desperate, but at the beginning of the war you'll see a lot more Northern nurses than you would Southern nurses. But women also have the responsibility of running farms and running businesses while men are gone. This will not be like the Revolutionary War where men come back for planting and harvest. There's not a lot of back and forth. There's a little bit of leave time given to some soldiers, but for the most part, when you're in for 3 years, you're in, and you're gone from home for years at a time. So if you want to come home to a successful store or business, you need a capable woman at home to run things. President Lincoln had some really bad luck with generals to start with. This is kind of one of the best known facts, I think, about the Civil War. Is that the first few generals he goes through, they don't even really want to fight. This is an interesting perspective because Lincoln's first choice for the job of Union general was Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee has a real hard time deciding what to do. But when Virginia secedes from the Union in the spring of 1861, Robert E. Lee decides to go with his state instead of with his country. All of these guys, they all went to West Point. They're all coming out of the same kind of factory system for military personnel, which means that they all know the same techniques, they all have the same training on weapons, and they all know each other. So it's, the Civil War is a lot about brother fighting brother and fighting, father fighting son and families divided. But it's also about the U.S. military being divided because in December of 1860, all of these guys are fighting for the same army, and then all of a sudden, 6 months later, they're on two separate sides of the fence. And arguably, the South got the general that Lincoln desperately wanted. The North has a real hard time, and Lincoln specifically, poor guy, he spent hours in the Library of Congress reading about military strategy, because remember, Lincoln, he doesn't have any military experience. He's never served in the Army. He didn't go to West Point. And he's got all these generals who won't fight. They won't be aggressive. They won't go attack Robert E. Lee. And that's what's needed here. You can't just let them sit there. Lincoln's so upset about this. You have to go fight these guys, because if you don't, they win by surviving. Just existing gives them more and more legitimacy every single day. So Lincoln is extremely frustrated by the lack of aggressiveness on the part of his generals. And so he tries to study up himself. What should they be doing? What is the right strategy? And he tries to sort of implement some of these ideas himself. Lee is going to just simply fight a defensive war until 1863 when he starts to move on Gettysburg, which will be a turning point for later in the war. His idea is the same as Lincoln's. He knows that just by holding steady, just by holding territory, they win. The problem is that all of the conflicts, the actual fighting of 1861 and 1862, they use up a lot of Southern supplies. And it's hard for the South to replenish supplies. They don't have as many people. They don't have as much food. They don't have as many guns. They don't have as much ammunition. So all of the fighting that takes place in those first kind of 2.5 years, even though Lee's army is still standing tall in 1863, they are really draining the supplies of the South unless they can finish this war quickly. And that's what's interesting about the Civil War, is that when it started, people thought it would be 6 months. 6 months will be done. 6 months will be done. Both sides thought that, which makes it kind of interesting. Really, there are a few people who said this is not going to be a 6-month war. Ulysses S. Grant, General Sherman, Sam Houston in Texas. There were people who said, I don't think this is going to be quick. I think this is going to be long and painful and really bloody. Those people end up being right, but a lot of people thought, oh, we'll just hurry up, get this over with, and it'll be fine. The early Union generals didn't like to listen to Lincoln any more than his cabinet did. They didn't really understand what the point was. They thought, well, we're fighting, we keep losing. I don't know why I have to chase him into Virginia. There's a lot of just stalling going on. there is another, I think maybe an interesting aspect to the Civil War. It has consequences for people who are at home. When you volunteered for the U.S. Army or the Southern Army during the Civil War, you were organized in your unit based on where you lived. So I'll give you an example this way. If there was a group of enlisted volunteers from the University of Texas Pan American, whole bunch of guys enlisted together, they would all fight together. Now that sounds pretty good. It's really good for camaraderie. But what happens when that unit of guys is completely annihilated at the Battle of Antietam? Means that one community, in this case the University of Texas Pan American, would have lost literally hundreds of people. There is a reason that we don't organize our troops this way anymore. Because during the Civil War, it's not just that families lost people, it's literally that entire towns, entire counties lost all of their young men in a single battle. That is devastating for morale at home. So when you saw that the 15th Pennsylvania Unit C was fighting at Gettysburg, whatever town, say Harrisburg, sent those guys, Harrisburg might lose all of those guys in a single battle. We have examples of towns who have one young man left between the ages of 18 and 25. One in an entire town. We have examples of units where the only person who ends up coming home is the doctor who went with them because he had been those kids' doctors for their whole lives. We've got a lot of doctors actually who delivered those babies when they came into the world and then deliver them as they leave the world. There is a reason we don't organize things this way anymore. We also have the issue of a navy. The U.S. government has a navy. The South does not. This means that the Union is actually going to be able to use its navy to sort of blockade the South in place. It's going to be really hard for the South to get goods and services in and out using their port cities because the Union Navy is going to be there. We do have some new technology that people are going to kind of roll out for the Civil War. Some of it's interesting. Iron-sided ships are not submarines. I don't want you to get confused because I know that's kind of what it sounds like. It's actually ships that sit really low in the water. They kind of look like turtles, but really big turtles. And they are literally sided. They're covered with iron so that when they're hit with artillery fire, they don't sink, or at least that was the intention. A lot of these are going to be used on places in the Mississippi. That was a place where a regular wooden ship wouldn't really be able to fit. And so these iron-sided ships become really strategic, especially for all of the fighting in the West. By the end of the war, we're going to see a lot of use of the repeating rifle. These rifles had barrels that had a channel cut in them. They were spiraled so that the bullet, the shell, comes out of there at a really, really quick speed. Pretty much all rifles are this way today. They are rifled on the inside. But the Union is the first to really use these in any large numbers. They were more accurate. They had a longer range on them. And they do extraordinary damage once they hit somebody. They literally go into the body and explode again. They shatter everything that they touch. So it's not a clean shot. If you get shot through the arm, your arm is literally shattered from the inside. It's one of the reasons there were so many amputations during the Civil War, is that there was literally no way to save your limb if it had been hit. And the ammunition that they're using as well kind of contributes to that. We've got improved cannon. The piece of artillery that you're looking at here is a 13-inch mortar. And this was big for the 1860s. This fires a huge piece of artillery. And this is a Union weapon, in case you're curious. There's not a lot of fighting in formation. They do line up in formation, where they're in big blocks of people or big rows. But a lot of the fighting is done in broken formation. People are hiding behind fences and hiding in ditches and hiding behind rocks and jumping over embankments. There is hand-to-hand combat in the Civil War, a great deal. There's a reason that they use the term fixed bayonets, so that you could put your knife on the end of your rifle and start stabbing people. You know, you have to get pretty close to somebody to stab them. So there's a lot of very personal combat and really difficult fighting that takes place during the Civil War. They even tried at various points to use hot air balloons. They would send the balloon up to see where the enemy formations and lines were. And then that way they would know where to put, you know, more troops on this side or fewer troops on this side, or they're coming down the middle. The problem with the hot air balloon, and they found this out quickly, was that it makes a really easy target because it's a giant balloon. And so as soon as it comes up, sharpshooters from the other side would start taking pot shots at it to bring it down. But it was something new for the Civil War that they tried. Both sides will utilize the railroad lines and the telegraph lines that were built during the 1840s and 1850s. The advantage here is to the North, because they had way more lines to start with. They have way more railroad miles, way more telegraph wires. The South doesn't have as many. So the South has a hard time dealing with the various aspects of, you know, it's convenient. It's convenient to have railroads to bring you supplies. It's convenient to get up-to-date information about the telegraph. It is not necessarily as convenient if you don't have enough of those things. A lot of the first success for the Union comes in the West. And I'm not talking far west, although there is fighting everywhere. There is fighting in California. There is fighting in open territory in places like Oklahoma. But this west specifically is around the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River becomes a very strategic location during this war. And Generals Grant and Sherman, who will be kind of our big northern heroes of the Civil War, cut their teeth in the West. They are responsible for getting control of the Mississippi River, gaining control of New Orleans ultimately, and you'll notice that's early. New Orleans falls in 1862, and they kind of surrendered a little bit because they didn't really want the city burned down. So the people of New Orleans, they were a little wishy-washy on the war anyway. They had a lot of people who really supported it, but they also had a lot of people who didn't. So New Orleans will be in Union hands by 1862. Grant and Sherman, despite the fact that they have success here, and the sketches of the Battle of Vicksburg, which is in Mississippi, Grant and Sherman do not necessarily have the best personal reputations in the Army. Grant specifically has a reputation for being a drunk, and he did drink quite a bit, and Sherman has a reputation for being a depressed, crazy person. I suspect today people would say that Sherman was a manic depressant. He had extremely dark periods where he talked about killing himself and rough going. And so both of them have a really hard time mentally during the early stretches of the war. Grant is relieved from command at one point. Sherman has to go home to rest because he gets so depressed that he can't do anything anymore. It's amazing that either one of them actually was brought back. But that's how bad the generaling was on the side of the North, that they bring back a guy who drinks too much and a guy who tries to kill himself occasionally to lead the final charges of this war. The battles of the West that are of the most importance are the battles of Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Murfreesboro. The first and the last are in Tennessee. The Battle of Vicksburg, like I said, is in Mississippi. The goal here, the reason that this is such an important place, is that if you take control of the Mississippi, you divide the South in half. You cut off the main section of the South from Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. And Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas are food-producing states. Texas obviously produces cotton, but it also produces cattle and beef and meat. Louisiana produces sugar. Arkansas produces rice. These may not be the foods we associate with the South, but they are foods that would come in handy for the Southern Army. So when the Mississippi is locked down, the South has been isolated. You have the western part of the South and the eastern part, and the eastern part cannot connect with the West once the Union controls the Mississippi. In Virginia, which is where most of the fighting actually takes place, the Union Army is having a hard time. The early battles of Bull Run and Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, they're all losses for the Union, and we're not messing around with small losses here, folks. We are losing tens of thousands of soldiers in each of these battles. It's not like they lost 500 people and just kind of went back to camp and went, oh, well, we'll try again tomorrow. When you lose 10 and 15,000 soldiers, you are debilitating your army and you're killing morale. And so this is what makes Lincoln so frustrated during 1861, 1862. He can't get anybody to chase down General Lee. He can't get anybody to really invade the South and aggressively go toward Richmond. There's only 100 miles between Richmond, Virginia and Washington, D.C. Most of this fighting takes place in that 100 miles between the two capitals, and Lincoln can't get anybody to go all the way to Richmond. Finally, there is a break. In 1862, the Battle of Antietam, which is where this photograph was taken, the Union does technically win the battle, but it comes at a heavy, heavy cost. At Antietam, there are 22,000 deaths in a single day of fighting, and most of these battles took place over 1 to 3 days. So if you think about 22 losses in a single day and you multiply that by a couple of days, you are losing tens of thousands of people. It is the single most costly day of the entire war. 22,000 people died in a single day. This isn't exactly a victory. This is a victory that has an awful cost. The problem is that we're at the end of 1862 at this point. This horrible loss is the only win that the Union has had in Virginia. It's the only real victory that Lincoln can point to in his own backyard. And he's going to need to use that for leverage as we move into 1863.